Okay, so here we are at part 3, the final part of lesson 4. We're going to talk about the poet Sappho. I'm very excited for this lecture because this is our first real look at lyric poetry, which is one of my favorite things to read in the sense we usually think of lyric poetry. The great hymn to the Aten and the Psalms for the Bible were also examples of lyric poetry, but not what I typically think of with lyric poetry. The Great Hymn to the Aten was 110 lines, so quite a bit longer than not narrative poetry by any means, but quite a bit longer than what we typically think of with short lyric poetry. And then the Psalms are wonderful. I love the Psalms. But again, they're focused on a specific subject, humans' relationship with God, which is one of the most, if not the most important subjects of all time. But with lyric poetry, we're able to dive into a wealth of other subjects and that are fascinating. And so this will be our first real look at lyric poetry in the way most scholars traditionally think of that word. And Sappho was an incredibly influential poet who's still widely read today, who gives some really interesting insights to Greek culture in kind of a different way than we've had before. So hopefully this will be fun. All right, so we know hardly any about her biography, so I have just a few quick kind of biographical notes here, though not many. Sappho was the only ancient Greek female author whose work survives in more than tiny fragments. And as the introduction to the textbook explains, much of her work is also fragmented, but we still have whole poems, and that cannot be said for any other female author from ancient Greece. And so that fact alone makes her a really significant figure in the history of world literature. Other writers and audiences greatly admired Sappho at the time. One poet even called her the 10th muse. And so if you looked at the beginning of the Odyssey or the Iliad, there's always this evocation to the muses, where kind of like the muses were these female figures in Greek culture who supposedly inspired the writers like Homer, and there were 9 of them in Greek legend. So calling Sappho the 10th one is high praise indeed. She lived on this island called Lesbos, and it was a very interesting society. I don't know if there's ever been a society quite like it in human history. And some of the things about the nature of that society led people to come up with the term lesbian in the 19th century. So what was the society like? It was a world in which girls lived in an intense communal life of their own, enjoying festivals and activities in which only women took part. This was really unique at the time because most societies were what we call patriarchal, which means male-dominated and male-centric, where they had male leadership, and a lot of the laws and other things gave most of the benefits to men, and women were fairly limited in what they could do in terms of getting a job or any kind of work outside the home. But this island of Lesbos, where Sappho lived, was very different in that there were a lot of women there, and there were a lot of, like this bullet point says, festivals, activities, things to do that only women took part in, where they could be with each other, not necessarily in a romantic or sexual way, but just develop female friendships without having to worry about supporting, I guess you could say, would be the way to say it, the males of the society. And so in that sense, it was communal and intensely communal. But it also says a life of their own, which means they had some independence, some autonomy to kind of do what they wanted. So this was an incredibly unique society, even in ancient Greece. And like the textbook says, we don't know much about, because we know so little about ancient Greece. Most of what we get is kind of a window into ancient Greece through the literature. So we don't know what the attitude was towards same-sex relationships in ancient Greece. Her poetry certainly depicts them, but we don't know kind of what the standard thoughts were. So we don't know if she was kind of going against the grain or just depicting something that was typical in ancient Greek life. We don't really know kind of what the standards were. We know those relationships existed, and she had them. So we shouldn't read too much into that, since we don't know enough about Greek culture to fully understand the context of them. What I can say is her poems are incredibly passionate. In regardless of what one believes or thinks or lives out on this subject, we can learn a lot from Sappho's poems about what she teaches us about human desire and the human psyche. And so they're incredibly important poems for those reasons. Because we know very little about her biography, we cannot assume that the speakers of her poems always represent her. This is an important thing to remember when reading poetry. There are some guidelines to reading poetry. And if this were an introduction to poetry course, we'd go over those in more detail. But one of them is that with short lyric poetry, there's what we call a dramatic situation. So in that situation always involves two figures, a speaker and a listener. So someone is saying the poem, the speaker, and there's an implied or an assumed audience. And one of the first rules of reading poetry is not to assume that the speaker and the author, the person who wrote the poem, are the same person. You can't assume that, no matter how personal the poem is, or no matter how close to the author's biography it may be. You just can't make that assumption because it's not always true. In some cases, it seems very obvious. In some cases, it is true. Some cases, the author intends to be the speaker, and they'll outright tell you that. But you just can't assume it unless you know it, unless the author has said so. And obviously, we know very little about Sappho, so we don't know. She uses her own name frequently, so we want to make that assumption. But we also want to be fair. There could be a lot of reasons she would use her own name, but not necessarily be talking about herself. So we don't want to make the assumption that the poems are biographical just because she uses her name. That would be kind of a leap in logic. One last bit of detail about this unique culture on the island of Lesbos is that Sappho composed her poems for dancing, singing women to perform, called a chorus. So we call these lyric poems, but they're really like song lyrics. We just don't have the music to them today because that's been lost. But, I just find that fact fascinating. And when I read them, I try to kind of imagine what would these be like set to music. So there's some background on Sappho. Let's take a look at her. When we read the Great Hymn to the 10, I went over some guidelines for reading short lyric poetry because it's so different than the fictional reading most people do today. It's another type of fiction, but it's not fiction in the sense it's not prose. And even the narrative poems like Gilgamesh, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, they're very similar to reading fiction because they tell a narrative, where lyric poetry, rather than tell a narrative, focuses on a subject, and it uses poetical language and devices like metaphors and personification that writers of fiction and even writers of narrative poetry typically don't use as frequently. So you have to kind of decipher lyric poetry. And I went over these guidelines with Hymn to the 10, but I want to review them again since it's been a couple lectures since we looked at poetry and short lyric poetry. And now that we have lyric poetry in the traditional sense, where it is indeed very short and focused on a single subject, and this is our second time doing it, I want to add a couple more guidelines, kind of up the level of the complexity of the steps. Hymn to the 10 was very short, it was very long, so you couldn't apply all of the steps there. But with Sappho, the poems are very short. There's even very few words in a line, and they're very few lines. They're like 24 lines rather than 110, and they're very short lines. So I want to give you more guidelines to help you with these poems. And like I said before, take some time with them. If you read the poem at a normal pace, a lot of these will take you 30 seconds or 1 minute. Whereas you probably spent hours reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, I'm not saying you need to spend hours on Sappho, because I do intend for her to be like Aesop, to be the shorter piece, since the Odyssey is such a long piece. But spend more than the time it would take you to just read it at a normal pace. If it would take you 1 minute to read the poem, spend 10 minutes or 20 minutes and go through these steps. Poetry is a tough genre because it requires these steps to truly be appreciated by their reader. And so I understand why it is a turnoff and not many people, get deeply into the genre. But as someone, I'll tell you, as someone who was a skeptic before, who did not like poetry before, if you can get into it, it is incredibly enjoyable. And if you go through these steps, even though they're a lot of work, they'll be well worth the reward. So without further ado, here are the steps. Read the poem once at a normal pace to get a feel for the language. I've added this step because you usually want to read poetry more slowly, but it has this poetic language like I was talking about. And so it's good, just go through it once at a normal pace, get a feel for that language, absorb it, and then follow these other steps. On your second reading, read the poem again, but out loud and slowly, which will give you a feel for the rhythm. These were song lyrics. Poetry is very rhythmic. If you go more slowly, you'll notice the commas, the periods, which is the author guiding you when to stop, when to pause, and that gives it another feel. So once at a normal pace for the language, once at a slower pace for the rhythm, and make sure that second time is out loud. Once you've gone through it a couple of times and have kind of absorbed it more and gotten a feel for it, you still don't know what the heck the author's talking about, but you've at least gotten a feel for it. So then after you've done that, go through and try to paraphrase in your own words what each line of the poem means by making notes in the margins. So like I've said before, writing while you read helps you remember things better. That's why we have the reading questions to give you some things to write about in the margins of your textbook. But with poetry, this is exactly what you should write about in the margins of textbook. It's, even though it's in English, translated to English, it's poetic language. So there's metaphors, there's personification. It's not told in a straightforward way like a narrative. So what do you think the words mean in just kind of standard English? A poet is someone who tells you something in an indirect way. Imagine they're telling you it in a direct way and write that down in the margins. Once you've paraphrased it line by line, go through your paraphrase, read it, absorb that so you think you kind of have the meaning now. After you've absorbed your paraphrase, read the poem out loud again slowly. You'll be absorbing it again, but now you'll perhaps know what it means, what it's actually talking about. And so just reading it will have new meaning, new relevance for you. And then this is a step I've added. At the end, after you've read through it again, after the paraphrasing, try to sum up the entire poem in just a few sentences to get a sense of its unity. That word unity is really important because most short lyric poems give us a cohesive whole work. And if paraphrasing each line is really good to help us decipher the meaning, but what does it all mean? How do we put it all together? So once you have a really good feel and you think you know what it means, try to go from, you've paraphrased every line, try to convert that to just one or two sentences or two or three sentences, very short. Like if someone said, what's this poem about? And you had, 30 seconds, what would you tell them? And then you'll have like this cohesive whole and you'll really understand the poem. And that's when you can see the beauty of it, enjoy the language. Finally, you could think about what is significant or meaningful about the message of the poem. So you've got the unity. What does that unity matter? This is the learning question. This is what we get to at the end of each lesson. Like, why is this important? Why is this relevant? Why did I read this? It's a question you should answer about any text that's worth reading more than once. So these are my guidelines for reading short lyric poetry. In just a minute, I'm going to model these for you with one of Sappho's poems. So at the end of the lecture, I'll have discussion board questions like usual, but the first one of those questions will be to just do these steps for any Sappho poem of your choice. And then you can, for your discussion board post, type up the unity of it. Now, it needs to be 250 words, so you might also say something about the significance or the meaning, but you don't have to do every line on the discussion board. So that might be a choice a lot of you like. Usually when I teach the students like doing that choice as opposed to some of the other questions. Although the other questions are good too. So I want to model that for you. What does it look like to go through these steps before actually asking you to do that on your own? So first, I'll review the reading questions, and then I'll model this with just one Sappho poem. Then you have the rest of the poems or that one to choose from to do this yourself, or pick another question for the discussion board. Okay, so the reading questions were to apply those strategies. I hadn't given you the extra ones yet, but review lesson 2, apply those. That's straightforward. This other point is really interesting. Sappho is the only ancient Greek female author whose work survives more than tiny fragments. We established that already. So with that in mind, think about this question. The Iliad and the Odyssey were written by a man, focused mainly on male characters, and emphasized many masculine themes. With this information in mind, what are some immediate differences you notice between Sappho's poems and the Homeric epics? This is really the fourth piece of Greek literature we've looked at if you count Aesop's fables. And so, the Iliad tells us about war. The Odyssey tells us about life beyond war. Aesop's fables tell us what life was like for the average ordinary person, not the kings and generals who are represented in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And we round out our view of Greek culture here with Sappho giving us the female perspective, which is really interesting because she actually has poems about the Trojan War, but her take on it is very different than Homer's. So, we keep getting a window into Greek culture through these wonderful texts. Now we get yet another nuance with this female perspective. So that is quite interesting, something to think about as we look at the poems. Okay, so now we're going to go through the poem, and what I'm actually going to do is read the poem once in its entirety, just like I recommended. We're going to go through the steps. So I'm going to read it once in its entirety because it's not very long. It won't take up too much of your time. And then I'll go through each stanza and paraphrase each stanza. And this is just the first poem. We'll talk about why I chose that poem in a minute. So here we go. Poem 1 by Sappho. Deathless Aphrodite of the spangled mind, child of Zeus who twists lures, I beg you, do not break with hard pains, O lady, my heart. But come here if ever before you caught my voice far off, and listening left your father's golden house and came. Yoking your car, and fine birds brought you, quick sparrows over the black earth, whipping their wings down the sky through midair. They arrived, but you, O blessed one, smiled in your deathless face, and asked what now again I have suffered, and why now again I am calling out, and what I want to happen most of all in my crazy heart. Whom should I persuade now again to lead you back into her love? Who, O Sappho, is wronging you? For if she flees, soon she will pursue. If she refuses gifts, rather will she give them. If she does not love, soon she will love, even unwilling. Come to me now. Loose me from hard care, and all my heart longs to accomplish. You be my ally. So hopefully you read it through before that. Now I've read it out loud. I tried to pause when they were periods, and it's really interesting where you read a whole line, and in the middle of the next line is the period rather than at the end of the line. So it's very intentional where she wants you to pause. And that's the kind of thing you want to hear out loud. So now that we've done it in our heads and out loud, let's go through and paraphrase. Now these lines are very short, and they're fairly straightforward compared to other examples of lyric poetry. And I don't want to take up too much of your time. So I'm just going to paraphrase each stanza, which is each set of 4 lines, not every single line. And I chose this poem because it's very typical of her, and that it's about unrequited love, but it also deals with a goddess, Aphrodite, so it also brings in that component of a Greek culture, which is the relationship to the gods. So let's go through it here. And I'll read each stanza and then my paraphrase this time through. This is what I'm talking about taking time with poetry. You can read a short poem dozens of times in just a few minutes, and so reading it multiple times is good. So this time through, I'll break after each stanza and do my paraphrase. Deathless Aphrodite of the spangled mind, child of Zeus who twists lures, I beg you, do not break with hard pains, O lady, my heart. So here the speaker is calling out immortal Aphrodite of shifting mind. Spangled means kind of like changing. I beg you, hear my heart. So she's basically just crying out to this goddess for help. And you'll see the phrase deathless Aphrodite. The gods were immortal. You saw that phrase in the quote from the Odyssey, and it's a phrase they used a lot when they were talking to the gods. They wanted to praise them, or even just talking to other people about the gods. They always included this. Because one of the main kind of nuances of Greek culture is the contrast between mortal humans and immortal gods. And that's crucial to the Odyssey. That's part of how Odysseus makes his case to get the Phaeacians' help to get home is, I'm not immortal, is what he says to them. And the contrast is here again like that, because this poem is about, in one respect, is about asking Aphrodite for help. So she needs to show here that she, the speaker, is not deathless, not immortal like Aphrodite. Okay, stanza 2. I come here if ever before, you caught my voice far off, and listening left your father's golden house and camp. So if you hear my voice and have ever left your father's house, do so now. So the hear my voice here, she's crying out to Aphrodite. It's supposed to be intense and emotional and dramatic. And Aphrodite is Zeus's daughter. So it's requesting a god to come down from Olympus and help. And that's a big request. And so she's saying in a way, if you ever leave your father's house, if there's a reason to come down to earth, please come for me. Hear my voice. Hear my plea. Okay, moving along. Yoking your car. So come yoking your car. And fine birds brought you, quick sparrows over the black earth, whipping their wings down the sky through midair. You'll notice there's no punctuation here. She's yoking your car, so like in a chariot with birds carrying the chariot. But what you have is a really interesting poetic effect here where the phrase from the previous stanza, and listening left your father's house, and listening left your father's golden house and came, yoking your car. So coming on a carriage. But after yoking your car, after just 3 words, period, the rest of the stanza has no punctuation other than 1 period. So, and fine birds brought you, quick sparrows over the black earth, whipping their wings down the sky through midair. So you can envision birds carrying Aphrodite's chariot to earth, but it's moving quickly. It's a fast motion. The speaker needs help, so Aphrodite could be coming quickly if she hears the speaker's plea, and the use of punctuation indicates that here. And that's why reading it out loud, that's one example of why that's so important. So you could translate this as, come fast on your chariot over the darkened earth with the help of your birds. Aphrodite was just commonly associated with birds, and a goddess could probably come without their help, but it furthers the imagery, evokes the imagery of Aphrodite, and moreover kind of creates an image of this chariot, right, moving quickly, which is a powerful image. Imagery is another important part of lyric poetry, and really makes the scene intense. In the darkened earth, or black earth, gives the contrast of the speaker is not in a happy place, kind of contrasting the blackened earth with, white glowing Olympus where the gods live. Okay, stanza 4. I'm going to read this again because the punctuation, it's a tactic of Sappho's where the punctuation is like at the start of the new stanza. So I'm going to read both. And fine birds brought you, quick sparrows over the black earth, whipping their wings down the sky. Through midair they arrived, but you, O blessed one, smiled in your deathless face and asked what now again I have suffered and why. Now again I am calling out. So again, the contrast between the speaker who's suffering from unrequited love and Aphrodite who's immortal and smiling. And she says, if you come here, you'll ask, why am I in pain? Why do I need your help? So this leads to kind of a shift in the poem where now the speaker is going to explain to Aphrodite why she needs her. And all this is kind of imagining what would happen if Aphrodite did come down. She's imagining Aphrodite would then ask her, why do you need me? And that's what happens next. And what I want to happen most of all in my crazy heart, Whom should I persuade now again to lead you back into love? Who, O Sappho, is wronging you? So you have an interesting thing here where Sappho doesn't use quotation marks, and that's an intentional strategy to kind of obscure the meaning. Poets do that. They could tell you in a direct way, but if they wanted to tell you what they wanted to say in a direct way, they wouldn't be writing poetry. They'd be writing an essay or a novel or something, but they're writing poetry, and so they're indirect. And so you have speech shifting here. The first line and a half is the poet, the speaker speaking, and the second half is Aphrodite speaking. Again, in this imagined scenario, that Aphrodite did come and indeed help the speaker. And so the speaker says, and what I want to happen most of all in my crazy heart. So whatever this is, whatever she needs, she really badly wants it to happen. And Aphrodite has sensed it's about unrequited love. So she says, whom should I persuade now again to lead you back into her love? Who, O Sappho, is wronging you? So when Sappho says, this is what I want to happen most of all, Aphrodite senses it's about unrequited love and says back to her, who has wronged you? Who can I persuade to reciprocate your love? All right, next stanza. For if she flees, soon she will pursue. If she refuses gifts, rather will she give them. If she does not love, soon she will love, even unwilling. So this is not the speaker pursuing her beloved, it's the beloved. Read it carefully. For if she flees, soon she will pursue. If she refuses gifts, rather she will give them. So what the speaker's saying here is there'll be a change. Through the help of Aphrodite, through her power, if the beloved does not want to be with the speaker, soon she will. She'll change her mind. If she does not give, if she refuses the speaker's gifts, soon she'll make such a big shift, she'll give them to the speaker. Even if she does not love the speaker, soon she will love the speaker, even unwilling. So this is a powerful stanza. This is one of the reasons why scholars love this poem, because it's a very forceful poem about female passion, where she is like, no, I will force this person, even with the help of Aphrodite, to love me. That's how powerful unrequited love, those feelings can be. I'm sure we've all experienced that kind of intense attraction to someone who didn't return it before, and the kind of all-consuming feelings that come with it. This is a very human thing we can relate to here. And so I would translate these as, if at first she does not give me what I want, she later will, even if by force, she being, the beloved of the speaker. Okay, final stanza. So in this final slide of the close reading here, before we get to the discussion questions, excuse me, I'll not only paraphrase the last stanza, but I'll also give you my unity statement and my significance statement to go back to our steps as I model this approach. Come to me now, loose me from hard care, and all my heart longs to accomplish, you be my ally. Come to me now, loose me from hard care, and all my heart longs to accomplish, you be my ally. So she's saying, come to me now, Aphrodite, and release me from the pain my heart feels by becoming my ally. So she's laid out for Aphrodite what would happen if she did come. And in stanza 6, that culminates with her beloved making a 180-degree love to 180-degree turn from reciprocal love, from unrequited love to reciprocal love. And she's saying, that's what would happen if you did come, Aphrodite. So in stanza 7, please come and take away my pain by forcing my lover to love me. You're a goddess, you can accomplish this. That's the last stanza. So take a step back now, read the poem again, review what I've just read, read the poem again. Now I can say in a couple sentences what the poem is about as a whole. In Sappho's poem 1, the speaker is suffering heartbreak after being rejected by her beloved. The speaker asks the powerful Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite, to come relieve her suffering by forcing her beloved to love her. So just a couple sentences. There's a lot of nuances, the punctuation that's not in there, but it sums it up in 10 seconds for someone. That's the moment where you know you've truly understood the poem. But why read it? Why does it matter? It's from 3,000 years ago. Well, this poem beautifully illustrates the depth of emotional and psychological suffering and turmoil one can experience, as well as the extreme actions they may consider when they are rejected by someone they love. This is a universal theme to which all readers can relate. Specifically regarding Greek culture, this poem teaches us how deeply the Greeks believed in the power of their gods to intervene on their behalf. Why is this significant? What do I mean here? Well, as I said before, world literature like this usually operates on two levels. On one level, it teaches us something, gives us a window and insight to this culture. On another level, if it's still around today, we're still reading it today, it has something universal that transcends that culture and applies to everyone that we can learn from. And so this poem, if someone didn't know about the Greek gods and the role the gods played for people in that culture, this poem would really illustrate a lot, because all of the speaker's hopes are contingent on the actions of Aphrodite. It also gives us a Greek feminine perspective, because it's all about unrequited love and the passion, the intensity, the force that comes with unrequited love. And you don't get anything like that in the Iliad or the Odyssey. So it deepens and expands both breadth and depth of our knowledge of Greek culture. But what if we don't care about the Greeks? What if someone's not interested in learning about the Greeks? I think it's always good to learn about the Greeks, but how can this poem help me today as a human being? Well, every person in the world experiences rejection by someone they love at some point, and that's intensely painful. Psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, I would argue that hurts. And so this poem really gives a window into the psychology of someone suffering that. And, a lot of that can be self-inflicted. I'm not trying to, make excuses for this person, but we get an insight into what they're experiencing, and we see how they might act. Stanza 6, which is the powerful stanza where, this person will be made by force to love me. It's an exaggeration a bit, but it's an exaggeration that represents the psyche. While we might not all call on Greek gods, because we don't really have religions that believe in that kind of interaction today, we do sometimes have, think about going to extreme lengths, and we probably wouldn't actually, most of us, carry out those actions, but we might want to, or we might feel like we want to powerfully when we're suffering heartbreak. And so this poem really gives a window into that psyche. And I once had a professor say one of the best ways to mend a wounded heart is to write about it. And so I think that's a lesson we can learn from this poem. Maybe it helps Sappho just to write it. And, if we're struggling with a wounded heart, maybe reading this poem would help us. Or if we have a friend or family member who's struggling with a wounded heart, maybe this poem would help us see how to counsel them. So I think there's a lot of value here. And now you've seen all the steps. Now you've seen it took work. It took us like 20 minutes to go through that. But look at the reward. Look at the payoff of what we've learned from it. And we got to experience beautiful language along the way. We got to experience language like quick sparrows over the black earth, whipping their wings down the sky through midair. In language like, if she does not love, soon she will love, even unwilling. Intense, powerful. Discussion board questions. Pick one poem and analyze it, following the steps I just went through. You can do the same poem or any poem by Sappho. Discussion board posts have to be 250 words. If you did every line, it'd probably be more than that. So on your own, in your textbook, do every line. But then on the discussion board, just do the unity. That might not get you to 250 words, so also do the significance, what I just modeled there. But maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you'd have kind of a hard time figuring out what direction to go. So if you don't want to do that, here are some questions as this one's very open-ended, these other questions will kind of point you in a specific direction, and they bring up issues or things, important themes going on in other Sappho poems. So for instance, the kind of question I dealt with here, how do the poems depict the relationships between humans and gods or goddesses? What do the poems tell us about those interactions in Greek culture? And so, this particular poem does that, but other ones do as well. So you could talk about any poem to answer that question. Poems 16 and 44 deal with the Trojan War, and I would love to read what you think about that, because there's this very different perspective from the one in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and it's great to get another angle on an event that's so important in Greek mythology. Poem 31 is her most famous poem, and it's very similar to this one in terms of it being about unrequited love, but it specifically deals with the themes of alienation, jealousy, or rage. So you could talk about one or all of those. And I'd love to see how is her take on rage in a situation about unrequited love, different from the take on rage in the Iliad, since that's the first main word of the Iliad. And then finally, poem 58 deals with the topic of getting old, aging, which is just kind of another interesting theme to explore. So I hope you enjoy our first foray into true lyric poetry, and that maybe one day you come to appreciate a genre that many consider difficult and inaccessible. Hopefully this lesson and the example made it more accessible.